Hello, class, and welcome to today's lecture on ethical harm reduction in addictions treatment. Now, as we dive into this really critical topic, I want to start by setting the stage with a little bit of a reflection to get us thinking about the real world implications and value of harm reduction strategies. Just imagine that you are a counselor working with a client who has been struggling with opioid addiction for several years. She's attempted traditional abstinence based treatments multiple times, but has faced numerous setbacks due to relapses. And despite her best efforts, she finds it difficult to maintain long term sobriety. Now, consider this. What if, instead of insisting on strict abstinence, you adopted a harm reduction approach for your client? What if your primary goal shifts from complete cessation of drug use to reducing the harms associated with her drug use? How might this change in approach impact her treatment journey? What ethical considerations might arise in a situation such as this? So that's just something I want you to think about. It's always better, in my opinion, to have an alive client that is struggling to a client that has an ideal goal but fails and ends up dying. In today's lecture, we're going to cover a few things. As always, I want to cover a little story about an important figure in this field. And then I want to take a little bit of time and introduce you to the whole idea of harm reduction. And we'll begin by defining harm reduction and examining its principles. And then we'll try to get a little bit of a contrast between harm reduction with traditional abstinence-based approaches. Next, we'll look at what are some of the ethical foundations of harm reduction, diving into the emphasis on kind of client-centered approach, the idea of autonomy. And then we'll explore a little bit of the practical applications and challenges of integrating harm reduction into treatment practice. Now, in the realm of addiction treatment and harm reduction, one name really stands out for his groundbreaking work in the field, and his name is Gabor Mate. Dr. Mate is a Canadian physician and author and speaker who has dedicated his career to understanding the complex interplay between addiction and trauma and mental health. He was born in Budapest, Hungary in 1944. And his grandparents were actually killed at Auschwitz when he was about 5 months old. Now, with a background in family practice and palliative care, Dr. Mate really kind of brings a unique perspective to the understanding of addiction as a response to pain in life and a feeling of disconnection with others. And his geographical location is unique as well. He has a clinic that works with individuals struggling with addiction in a place in Canada where addiction is rampant. There's a particular street, about 4 blocks of a particular street in the city of Vancouver on the west coast, that is famous for its street addiction. And that's where his clinic is located, in downtown Vancouver on the east side. It's in a neighborhood that's notorious for drug use and visible poverty. And Dr. Mate has witnessed firsthand the profound impact of things like trauma on substance use patterns. And Dr. Maddie is probably best known for his compassionate and holistic approach to addiction treatment, which really kind of emphasizes, that there's an importance to addressing the underlying emotional and psychological wounds of a person. A person that is healthy and happy and doesn't have trauma does not typically turn to drugs. And so he has several works. One that's very famous is something called In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, Close Encounters with Addiction. And in that, he really challenges the traditional views of addiction as a moral failing and highlights the need for individuals to be more empathetic, to feel what the client feels, and to have a trauma-informed approach to treatment. Now, because of his experience in palliative care, which is, if you are not aware, that's basically where people go for care in the last days of their life. It's basically the idea there is not to cure someone, it is to make them comfortable as they make their transition into death. And his work and his historical work with that, along with a lot of his patients having mental health issues and substance use issues and experiencing chronic health concerns such as HIV, has led to his view that there needs to be a way of reducing the harm. And so he's worked with the government to set up harm reduction clinics in his region. And what he's done there is work with persons with substance use disorders. And he's made headlines in creating Insight, which is basically a legally supervised safe injection site. And in the midst of that, he's been a very vocal proponent for policies that prioritize compassion and human dignity in addiction care. And his insight into the root causes of addiction and the importance of social connection really kind of resonate deeply with both clinicians and policymakers alike. And they shape the discourse surrounding addiction treatment and public health. And so I just want you to kind of be mindful that there are leaders out there that are interested in not necessarily curing people of an addiction or of their substance use, but reducing their harm to keep them and treat them as people. And so the question comes, how do we do that ethically? And ethics in the whole context of counseling and addiction treatment really refers to the moral principles and standards that guide our professional conduct and our decision making. It's, of course, something that's going to encompass our values and integrity and honesty and respect and responsibility. And all of these are really essential for maintaining the trust and well-being of clients. But in the midst of that, we also need to consider that people are in a vulnerable state, that individuals are grappling with their substance use disorders. And so counselors and addiction professionals need to adhere to the ethical standards that are going to ensure things like safety and dignity and autonomy. And so the ethical considerations really kind of play a prominent role in promoting the well-being of clients in addiction treatment. And so by upholding these ethical principles, counselors and addiction professionals can establish a therapeutic alliance built on trust and respect and collaboration. And the whole idea here is that we are working towards positive outcomes, not that. And so the idea as well is that there is care without fear of judgment or exploitation. Now, in the case of harm reduction, it's an issue of what you might call life over limb in harm reduction. And, that makes the ethical dilemma really complex because it arises out of situations where the priority shifts from preserving the health and well-being of individuals to preventing immediate harm or death. And so this dilemma is particularly relevant in harm reduction because where interventions aim to reduce the negative consequences associated with drug use, that's not the traditional approach. And so this can go on even if it means accepting certain risks to physical health or safety. So the harm reduction philosophy has the overarching goal of minimizing the harms associated with substance use while recognizing the reality that complete abstinence may not be immediately achievable or feasible for an individual. And so this approach acknowledges that some individuals may continue to engage in substance use despite efforts to promote abstinence, and therefore seeks to mitigate the potential negative consequences of their behavior. Now, the concept of life over limb raises some ethical questions about the extent to which harm reduction strategies should prioritize immediate safety and survival over long-term health outcomes. For example, in the context of opioid overdose prevention, the distribution of naloxone, which is an opioid antagonist that reverses overdose effects, is a key harm reduction intervention. Now, while naloxone can save lives by reversing overdoses, it does not address the underlying causes of substance use or prevent future overdoses. And so critics of harm reduction may argue that focusing solely on preventing immediate harm, such as overdose deaths, without addressing the root causes of addiction may perpetuate this whole cycle of substance use and dependency. And they may also raise concerns about the potential normalization or tacit acceptance of drug use that harm reduction strategies may inadvertently promote. Now, on the other hand, proponents of harm reduction argue that prioritizing immediate safety and survival aligns with principles of compassion, harm reduction, and human rights. Now, if we're to really kind of understand harm reduction as a public health approach, we need to kind of recognize that it aims to reduce the negative consequences associated with the risky behaviors, such as substance use, without necessarily requiring abstinence. So at its core, harm reduction recognizes the simple reality that individuals may continue to engage in substance use despite our efforts to promote abstinence, and despite our efforts to seek to minimize the potential harm they might continue to use. And so it's really a pragmatic approach that's, some would argue is very realistic. It's acknowledging that complete abstinence probably isn't in the cards. And so a more desirable approach, particularly for those that do not really desire to quit, is instead intervention focused, where we're reducing the negative consequences of the substance use and promoting survival. And the other thing that it does is it respects autonomy, because harm reduction recognizes the agency of individuals, recognizing their right to make informed choices, however destructive they may seem to be, about their own health and behavior. And so this principle really emphasizes the importance of meeting individuals where they are in their recovery journey and involving them in decision making about their care. And so the focus is on harm reduction. And harm reduction interventions, remember, prioritize reducing things like overdose deaths, preventing the transmission of infectious diseases like HIV and hepatitis, and minimizing social and economic harms associated with substance use. And so these goals really are what guide the development and the implementation of harm reduction strategies. And this is, of course, in a stark contrast to traditional abstinence-based approaches in addiction treatment, which really kind of emphasize complete cessation of substance use as the primary goal. And while abstinence-based approaches may be appropriate for some individuals, they may not be feasible or effective for everyone, particularly those with severe substance use disorders or those with complex needs. And unlike abstinence-based approaches, harm reduction does not require individuals to abstain from substance use entirely. Instead, it acknowledges that reducing the harms associated with substance use, such as overdose deaths and infectious diseases, can improve overall health and well-being, even if complete abstinence is not achievable. The other thing that it does is it recognizes one of the fundamental ethical foundations of recognizing that the autonomy of the person. And so there's a client-centered approach which prioritizes the autonomy and the agency of the individual seeking support. And so harm reduction recognizes that each person's experience with substance use is unique to them. And it's influenced by a myriad of factors, including their social and cultural and economic and psychological determinants. And by centering the individual in the treatment process, harm reduction respects their right to make these informed decisions, while preserving their freedom and also helping them participate in reducing their consumption, minimizing their harm, and ideally pursuing their own abstinence. The other thing that's really important about ethical harm reduction is the non-judgmental attitude and respect for diversity of the individuals that are in the professional's care. And really kind of recognizing that things like stigma and discrimination often exacerbate the harms associated with substance use. And so harm reduction emphasizes compassion and empathy and acceptance in working with clients. And so the final idea is the promotion of dignity and human rights for all individuals, regardless of their substance use history. And so harm reduction recognizes that every person has inherent worth and deserves to be treated with dignity and respect and compassion. And so within ethical harm reduction, there's a balance that needs to be made between reducing harm and that ultimate goal of abstinence. And so one of the primary ethical challenges is that balance. And sometimes that means dealing with conflicting goals. The ultimate goal of promoting abstinence of substance use versus preventing death and simply keeping someone alive, or preventing transmission of infectious diseases, and recognizing that people are complex and there are challenges. We can't just simply mandate abstinence. And so there is that reality that's there. And so at the heart of this challenge is the need to respect the autonomy and self-determination of individuals while balancing those goals and recognizing the realistic attainment of those goals. It's also about addressing societal stigma and resistance. Harm reduction means facing the ethical dilemmas that are related to advocating for harm reduction principles and environments, particularly where stigma and resistance are prevalent. Nobody wants a safe injection site next to their own building. It's a challenge, but it's also an important need. So it's about challenging what others will accept. It's about connecting with colleagues and policymakers in the broader community. And ethical harm reduction practice also involves challenging stigma and discrimination at individual levels and institutional levels and systemic levels. And it's about ensuring the safety and well-being of clients while minimizing the potential harms associated with substance use. And so that is, of course, a challenge of navigating the potential risks and benefits of these kind of interventions. So, for example, providing access to sterile injecting equipment is going to reduce the transmission of blood-borne infections, but may also inadvertently enable ongoing substance use. So there are those challenges that are going to be there. Now, one of the foundational principles of ethical practice and harm reduction is the importance of, as always, informed consent and shared decision making. And informed consent really requires that individuals are provided with comprehensive information about the risks and benefits and alternatives to harm reduction interventions, allowing them to make the kinds of autonomous decisions about their care that they need. And harm reduction practitioners engage in these kind of shared decision-making processes with their clients, and it's about discussing what are the realistic goals, what are the preferences, what are the values, and how can we help the client to meet those goals, and fostering a sense of ownership and agency in the recovery process by the client. Because if the client doesn't own the process, they're not going to engage in the process. They have to have a vested interest in it and see and feel that vested interest. The other thing, of course, is protecting client confidentiality and privacy. That is at the core of establishing trust and safety in the therapeutic relationship. So allowing individuals to disclose sensitive information about their substance use without fear of judgment or reprisal is an essential part of this process. And so harm reduction practitioners need to adhere to the strict confidentiality policies and practices that are going to ensure client information is kept confidential and disclosed only with the client's explicit consent or where it's required by law, and to push for laws that protect the client's information. And so this is, of course, is going to include those standards that are expected to be there at any time, where the electronic records be safeguarded, where there be a secure physical space, where protocols are implemented for the safe storage and the safe disposal of client confidentiality. And of course, every client has their own cultural background, their own needs and values and beliefs. And so part of ethical harm reduction practice needs to recognize the importance of cultural competence and sensitivity in working with individuals with diverse backgrounds. And cultural competence involves understanding and respecting the cultural beliefs and values and practices of clients, as well as acknowledging the impact of social and systemic factors on their health and well-being. Now, one of the ethical dilemmas in harm reduction arises when providing services to individuals with concurrent disorders. Remember, a client can have as many disorders as they want. They could have a dual diagnosis or co-occurring mental health conditions along with their substance use disorders. And so these individuals are often faced with very complex and overlapping challenges that require integrated and comprehensive treatment approach. And so ethical harm reduction practice involves navigating that tension between addressing immediate harm reduction goals, such as reducing overdose risk, and providing holistic care that addresses underlying mental health issues. And so practitioners must balance the need to prioritize safety and harm reduction with the importance of addressing the root causes of substance use and promoting overall well-being. And another ethical dilemma in harm reduction involves navigating the legal and policy constraints that may limit the availability and effectiveness of harm reduction interventions. And so, like, for example, in many jurisdictions, there are very punitive drug policies and regulations, and they may restrict the implementation of evidence-based harm reduction strategies, such as needle exchange programs or supervised injection sites. And harm reduction practitioners are going to face some ethical dilemmas related to advocating for harm reduction initiatives in environments where legal and policy barriers may exist. And so this may involve challenging some of these punitive or discriminatory laws and policies and advocating for legislative change and sometimes even civil disobedience. And so there is this challenge of managing the conflicts of interests and boundaries that can go on. And so an ethical harm reduction practice means maintaining, first off, professional boundaries and managing these conflicts of interest to ensure that the client's needs are prioritized above the personal and organizational interests. And so the practitioner may face some ethical dilemmas related to things like conflict of interest, such as the financial incentives of being paid by your institution or organization, or maybe even by the government, or competing priorities that may influence an individual's decision. So, like, for example, harm reduction organizations may receive funding from government agencies or even from pharmaceutical companies. And this may create potential conflicts of interest in the implementation of harm reduction interventions. And so the practitioner must navigate these conflicts with the typical integrity and transparency and commitment to prioritizing the well-being of the client that you would expect from a counseling professional. So, overall, integrating harm reduction into treatment practice really begins with collaborative goal setting and treatment planning. And so harm reduction practitioners are going to work very collaboratively with the clients to identify and prioritize goals that align with their values and preferences and their readiness for change. And so this collaborative approach really empowers clients to take an active role in their recovery journey. And this is going to foster a sense of ownership and agency in the decision-making process. And so by involving clients in goal setting and treatment planning, Harm reduction practitioners can tailor interventions to meet the unique needs and circumstances of each individual. The other thing is developing the kinds of strategies that are effective to minimize the negative consequences, and doing research to figure out what are the best strategies. So things like education and information, where you provide clients with some accurate and non-judgmental information about the risks and benefits of various substances, as well as the harm reduction strategies to reduce risks associated with their use. It's also about safe use practices, so encouraging clients to adopt safer use practices, such as using sterile injecting equipment, practicing safer sex, and avoiding mixing substances. It's about overdose prevention, so providing access to naloxone and overdose prevention training to reduce the risk of opioid overdose deaths. Maybe using under supervision to ensure overdose deaths do not happen. Infectious disease prevention, so offering needle exchange programs, syringe access, and testing and treatment for infectious diseases such as HIV and hepatitis. And some psychosocial support as well, so providing counseling to provide peer support and to access mental health services to address underlying factors that contribute to substance use. And by incorporating all of this in, as well as helping to manage relapse prevention, really kind of recognizes that relapse is a common and often inevitable part of the recovery process. Rather than viewing relapse as a failure, harm reduction practitioners are going to approach relapse with compassion and understanding, focusing on reducing the harm associated with substance use and supporting clients in re-engaging their treatment. Now, I really kind of see there being 4 components to ethical practice in harm reduction. So I want to kind of go over those. First off, there's the whole idea of ethical awareness, that first step in ethical decision making, which of course recognizes the presence of ethical issues with a given situation. And for harm reduction practitioners, it's about the ability to identify potential ethical concerns and dilemmas. And so this really involves being attuned to the values and principles and rights that are implicated in the context of harm reduction. So practitioners should consider factors like autonomy and beneficence and non-malfeasance and justice in this process. Then there's the whole idea of ethical judgment. And this really involves analyzing and evaluating the available options for action. Practitioners consider the ethical principles and values at stake, as well as the potential consequences and risks associated with different courses of action, and they weigh competing interests and prioritize, and they strive to make decisions that uphold the ethical standards of harm reduction practice. There are the ethical motivations, and these really deal with the practitioner's internal commitment to act ethically in the best interest of their clients. And so this means having a sense of integrity, recognizing their duty to promote the well-being and the rights of individuals that are struggling with substance use issues. And the final component of the model involves translating ethical awareness, judgment, and motivation into ethical behavior. And so practitioners implement their decisions in a manner that is consistent with ethical values and principles. And they take action to address ethical concerns and promote the welfare of the client. And this means working collaboratively. This means working and communicating openly and transparently, and respecting the autonomy and the dignity of the client. Now, when advocating for harm reduction, it's really all about social justice. Harm reduction practitioners are going to recognize that systemic barriers and inequalities such as poverty and racism and discrimination are going to contribute to the marginalization and exclusion of individuals struggling with substance use disorders. And so ethical harm reduction practice involves challenging these systemic barriers and advocating for policies and practices that promote equity and access and social justice. And so it also means advocating for policy changes and advocating for harm reduction initiatives. It may even include advocating for the decriminalization of drug possession and the expansion of harm reduction services such as needle exchange programs and supervised injection sites, and the implementation of overdose prevention measures such as naloxone distributed and other kind of Good Samaritan laws to kind of help to care for people. It also means supporting marginalized communities and individuals who face really disproportionate barriers to accessing care and resources. And so all of this plays a huge role in moving towards a place of ensuring that there are less overdose deaths and less health challenges related to substance use. Not getting rid of substance use, that's not realistic, but to reduce the harm. And so finally, ethical harm reduction practice begins with a commitment to professional competence and ongoing education. Addiction professionals recognize that people are complex, and we cannot live in a simplistic world thinking that just abstinence is the only answer. Life is much more nuanced and complex than that. And so we need to acquire and maintain the knowledge and skills and competencies necessary to provide the effective and evidence-based care to individuals struggling with substance use. This also, of course, means self-care and maintaining our own awareness of our own personal biases and values and limitations, and working with individuals, recognizing that working with individuals with substance use issues can be very emotionally demanding. It can be challenging. There can be health risks. There can be mental health risks. There are risk of lots of things, of physical harm, of burnout. And so practicing self-care strategies for professionals is a very important part of the whole process. Practicing things like mindfulness and stress management and seeking support from peers and supervisors is always important. And finally, there is the ethical obligation to clients and colleagues and society. We're there to support our clients. We're there to support our colleagues and not be fighting with our colleagues. Creating a positive professional environment is hugely important. So this means upholding the dignity of our colleagues as well, and also supporting society. It's not about beating down society because sometimes it's too rigid, but about supporting society as a whole to be more just and more empathetic and more caring. So a few key terms to kind of close out our lecture. First off, harm reduction. That is really a public health approach that aims to reduce the negative consequences associated with risk behaviors, such as substance use, without necessarily requiring abstinence. There's dual relationships. And remember, that's something that we need to be mindful of, that sometimes there can be multiple roles in relationships, such as being both a therapist and a friend, or employer or family member. And so dual relationships are going to present ethical challenges. And then stigma. And what is stigma? Stigma is the negative attitudes and beliefs and stereotypes that lead to discrimination and marginalization of individuals or groups based on certain characteristics or behaviors. And the last one, what is the primary focus of harm reduction? And of course, the answer is to reduce the negative consequences associated with substance use. So I just want to kind of close out and remind you that ethical harm reduction practice is essential in addressing the very complex challenges of substance use and addiction. And so by prioritizing the principles of compassion and respect and social justice, addiction workers can really effectively support individuals with their struggle by minimizing harm and improving their overall well-being. Remember, life over limb. A live client that is struggling is always better than one that has the ultimate goal of abstinence but ends up dying of an overdose. Hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I will see you next week. You take care. Goodbye.